Des Moines Valley, Iowa, October, 1891. The autumn air was crisp with the coming frost, but the talk of the settlement was hotter than any forge. It was all directed at one man, Ference Nemeth, and the bizarre spectacle taking shape on his small plot of land. With a team of borrowed mules and a groan of rope and timber, he was hoisting the entire hull of a derelict river barge over the roof of his small finished cabin. It hung there in the sky for a moment, a dark, tarred crescent against the pale blue, before settling onto a framework of heavy posts. Dale Osgood, the township clerk, and a man whose opinions were as solid as the oak he used for his desk, stood with his arms crossed. A small crowd of neighbors gathered around him. "It's the damnedest foolishness I've ever seen," he declared, not bothering to lower his voice. "Oh, he's built himself a sail. First good gale comes roaring down this valley, and that thing will lift his whole house clear to the next county." Caleb Finch, a carpenter who had built half the structures in the settlement, nodded grimly. "It'll catch the wind, Dale, no doubt. But if that don't get it, the rot will. He's trapped the roof. Come spring, the underside of that boat and the shingles on his cabin will be nothing but wet punk." "A fool and his money," muttered Jedediah Stone, the general store owner, calculating the imagined cost of the wood, the ropes, the barge itself, wasting good timber on a madman's fancy. Ference, hearing the murmurs, paused in his work, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a pitch-stained hand. He looked at the men, then at his work. Weinsteiner, a structure that looked for all the world like an overturned boat marooned on a rooftop. He offered no defense, no explanation. He simply picked up his bucket of hot pitch and went back to sealing the joints of the support posts. The mockery was a language he understood, even if the words were foreign. It was the sound of men who trusted only what they had seen before. What did this Hungarian barge caulker understand about dead air that the most experienced builders in Iowa had missed? Before we see how this strange, inverted boat weathered one of the most brutal winters in Iowa's history, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. We explore the forgotten wisdom of those who built our world, one practical innovation at a time. I promise you will learn something about the physics of warmth that might surprise you. Let us know in the comments, what's the strangest, yet most effective homemade solution you've ever seen? Ference Nemeth was not a carpenter. He was not a farmer or a frontiersman or an engineer. He was a calefactor, a caulker, from the shipyards along the Danube near Budapest. His life had been spent not in forests of pine and oak, but in forests of masts and hulls. His hands knew the heft of a caulking mallet, the feel of oakum being driven into a seam, the sharp, resinous smell of boiling pitch. He understood pressure. He understood the relentless, patient desire of water to find its way through the smallest crack, to seep, to soak, to rot, and to destroy. His entire trade was the art of creating an impenetrable skin, a perfect seal between the world inside the boat and the world outside. His wife, Ilona, and their two small children, 8-year-old Istvan and 5-year-old Jofia, had followed him across an ocean to this land of black soil and endless sky, a place that promised a life built on their own terms. Their first Iowa winter, in a hastily built cabin like all the others, had been a lesson in a different kind of pressure. It wasn't the steady push of a river, but the insidious pull of the cold. The winter of 1890 had been a brutal tutor. The nails in their roof, driven through the sheathing from below, acted as tiny conduits of cold. The warm, moist air from their breathing and cooking would hit these frozen points of metal and weep, leaving long, rusty streaks down the pale pine boards. By noon, on the coldest days, a thick dam of ice would have already formed along the eaves, a glittering, a beautiful menace that forced melting snow back up under the shingles, staining their ceiling and rotting the roof deck. Worst of all was the stove. It burned a furious amount of wood, glowing red at its base, yet the stovepipe just 2 feet from the flue was often cool enough to touch. All their precious heat, the product of countless hours of chopping and splitting wood, was flowing straight up and out through the thin membrane of their shingle roof, lost to the indifferent sky. That winter, the children were never without a cough, and Ilona's face was perpetually etched with worry. Ferenc knew he had failed to build a proper hull. His family was living in a sieve. The problem wasn't the stove, and it wasn't the wood. The problem was the roof. In 1891, a standard frontier cabin roof was a simple affair: rafters, sheathing, and a layer of wooden shingles. It was designed to shed water and hold up a load of snow. It was never truly designed to hold heat. The settlers fought this fundamental flaw with fire, feeding their stoves a constant diet of oak and hickory. They were engaged in a losing battle against physics. Heat moves in 3 ways: conduction, convection, and radiation. The standard roof was a victim of all 3. Heat conducted directly through the wood rafters and sheathing. But the real villain was convection. The warm air inside the cabin, being less dense, would rise. It would push its way through every tiny gap in the ceiling boards, swirling into the uninsulated attic space. There, it would hit the underside of the frigid roof deck, transfer its energy, and the heat would be lost forever. The air, now cold and dense, would sink back down, creating a continuous, invisible loop of circulation that actively pumped warmth out of the house. A family could burn through a cord of wood, a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long, in less than 3 weeks, and still wake to frost on their blankets. Across the valley, Ferenc's neighbors were preparing for the coming winter by amassing huge stockpiles of fuel. Silas Croft had spent the entire autumn hauling wood, his stack now looming larger than his barn. Caleb Finch, the carpenter, had meticulously chinked every log of his cabin with a mixture of mud and grass. Yet he knew from experience that his family would still spend most of January huddled in the single room with the stove. They accepted this as the price of life on the prairie. They saw the cold as a beast to be fought with sheer brute force: more wood, a bigger fire. They built thicker walls, but they ignored the gaping wound overhead. Their roofs were thermal sieves, and the Iowa winter was merciless to those who didn't understand the true nature of the enemy. The fight wasn't against the cold outside. It was a fight to keep the precious, man-made warmth inside. Ferenc began his project in September. He walked the 10 miles to the river landing and found what he was looking for: a flat-bottomed grain barge, 25 feet long and 12 feet wide, that had been holed on a rock and abandoned on a mud bank. Its hull was sound, made of thick oak planks, but its utility as a boat was over. He bought it from the shipping agent for $3, the price of scrap. Getting it to his property was the first spectacle. It took him and 2 hired men with a team of 4 mules 3 days to drag the heavy hull across the fields. The neighbors watched, shaking their heads. Nemeth's Folly, they started calling it. The real work began once it was there. He didn't just place the hull. He engineered a system. First, he built 10 stout posts of bur oak, 5 on each long side of his cabin, anchored deep in the ground. These posts rose to a height of 12 inches above the peak of his existing shingle roof. Heavy crossbeams connected the posts, creating a robust cradle. This was the foundation for his new sky. Then came the hoist. Using a block and tackle system rigged to a massive cottonwood tree, Ferenc and his team slowly, painstakingly, lifted the barge hull, flipped it upside down, and maneuvered it into place over the cabin. It settled onto the crossbeams with a solid thud that echoed through the small valley. From a distance, it looked absurd, like a child's toy boat dropped on a wooden block. It was during this phase that the criticism was loudest. Dale Osgood came by almost daily. "Ference," he said, trying to be neighborly, but failing to hide his condescension, "I'm the township clerk. I have a responsibility. That thing is a hazard. The wind will get under that curve and peel it off like a lid from a can. It will lift in the first gale." Ference, who was on a ladder applying a thick black coat of his proprietary pitch to the hull's exterior, just glanced down. "Hull is heavy," he said in his thick accent. "Wind goes over, not under." Caleb Finch offered his professional opinion. "You've created a trap, Nemeth. The sun will warm that hull, and the air underneath will get damp from the cabin. It'll sweat between the layers. You'll have mushrooms growing on your shingles by May. You're building a rot factory right over your family's heads." "It will be dry," Ference replied, his voice calm. He wasn't just painting the hull, he was performing a ritual from his old life. He had spent days boiling pine resin, linseed oil, and a bit of charcoal into a thick, waterproof sealant. He applied it hot, working it into every seam, every knot, every inch of the oak. He was making the hull as impervious to the air as he once made them to the Danube. The key was the seal. The air trapped between the hull and the roof could not be allowed to mix with the humid air outside. It had to be a captive, isolated body of air. When he was done, the hull was a monolithic black shell, gleaming under the autumn sun, perfectly sealed against the world. His cabin now had two roofs, one to shed the rain and a second, floating a foot above it, to defeat the cold. The genius of Ference Nemeth's creation wasn't the barge hull itself. It was the empty space beneath it. He had weaponized nothingness. The principle he had intuitively grasped was the profound insulating power of trapped or dead air. Air itself is a very poor conductor of heat. The individual molecules are too far apart to transfer thermal energy efficiently. The reason a gust of winter wind feels so cold is not because the air itself is a good conductor, but because of convection. Moving air steals heat. A constant flow of cold air molecules bumps against your skin, absorbs your warmth, and is then immediately replaced by new cold molecules. This process rapidly strips heat from any warm surface. A conventional, uninsulated roof is subject to this same convective loss, both inside and out. But by placing a second sealed roof a full 12 inches above his first, Ference stopped the cycle. He created a large, captive pocket of air. This air was a buffer zone. The heat leaving his living space would rise and warm the shingles of his inner roof. That roof would then radiate warmth into the 12-inch air gap. However, because that air was sealed and could not circulate with the outside atmosphere, it quickly stabilized in temperature. It could not form a strong convective loop. The result was a dramatic reduction in thermal transfer. The outer hull was still exposed to the -10 degrees Fahrenheit winter air, but it was no longer trying to steal heat directly from the living space. It was trying to steal heat from the buffer of dead air, which was itself a powerful insulator. It's the same principle as a double-pane window or wearing layers of clothing. The still air trapped between the layers does the real work of insulating. Numerically, the effect was staggering. A standard wood shingle roof in 1891 might have an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of less than 1. By adding the sealed 12-inch air gap, which has an R value of approximately 1 per inch when convection is stopped, and the thick oak hull, Ference had likely increased his roof's total R value to over 12. This was a tenfold improvement. He had, as the physics suggested, effectively halved his overhead heat loss. He wasn't just piling on more material, he was using a fundamental property of the universe to his advantage. The mockery he endured came from men who saw a foolish boat on a roof. They couldn't see the invisible shield of still air he had captured within it. The winter arrived not with a gentle snow, but with a siege of ice. In mid-January of 1892, a weather system stalled over the Des Moines Valley. The temperature plummeted to 10 degrees below zero and stayed there, locked in place. Then, the rain began. It wasn't snow, but a super-cool drizzle that froze the instant it touched any surface. For 12 straight days, it coated the world in a thickening layer of clear, dense, impossibly heavy ice. The valley became a glass sculpture of misery. Branches thick as a man's arm snapped from ancient oaks, with reports like rifle shots. Fences disappeared under glistening shrouds. Farmers struggled to break the ice from their well pumps and to keep their livestock from freezing standing in the fields. The conventional roofs of the settlement began to fail. The ice did not slide off the shallow pitch of the shingled roofs. It accumulated, layer by transparent layer. A square foot of shingles soon bore 10, then 20, then 50 pounds of ice. The sound of groaning timbers became common. Caleb Finch's woodshed, his own handiwork, was the first to go, its roof collapsing inward with a splintering crash. Silas Croft's barn began to sag ominously in the middle, its ridge beam bowing under thousands of pounds of accumulated weight. Inside the homes, the cold was worse than ever. The thick ice on the roofs acted as a massive heat sink, pulling warmth out of the houses even faster than usual. Families burned through their wood piles at an alarming rate, their stoves running day and night just to keep the indoor temperature above freezing. But at the Nemeth cabin, life was different. The sound of the freezing rain was not the sharp, brittle ticking it made on other roofs. On the curved hull, it was a dull, soft patter, the sound of something failing to get a grip. The curved shape, designed to shed water, performed even more brilliantly with ice. As soon as a thin layer formed, its own weight would cause it to lose its tenuous grip on the smooth, pitched arc of the hull. It would shear off in sheets and slide harmlessly to the ground. While every other roof in the valley was accumulating a deadly burden, Ferentz's hull remained almost entirely bare, its black tarred surface stark against the glittering white landscape. Inside, an impossible peace reigned. The great thermal wound at the top of the house had been healed. The stove consumed wood at less than half the rate of his neighbors, maintaining a steady, comfortable warmth. There were no rusty tears from the ceiling nails. There were no monstrous icicles clutching the eaves. The true proof was in the small details of domestic life, the things made possible by the absence of a struggle. Ilona could work her bread dough on the wooden table without it becoming stiff with cold. She left a small dish of butter out, and it remained soft and spreadable. The children, Istvan and Zsofia, could play on the floor in their stocking feet, building castles with wooden blocks, their laughter echoing in the warm, still air, a sound of impossible normalcy in the heart of the brutal siege. On the 12th day of the storm, the breaking point came for Dale Osgood. He was in the township clerk's office, a small, sturdy building he'd had built to his own exacting specifications, when a sound like a pistol shot echoed through the room. He looked up to see a crack race across the plaster ceiling. The massive weight of the ice had finally broken the back of his ridge beam. The entire roof was threatening to collapse. He needed tools, a heavy-duty jack, and thick timbers to shore up the beam before it failed completely. His own were in his shed, its door now frozen shut behind a wall of ice. He thought of his neighbors. Finch's woodshed was already a ruin. Croft's barn was on the verge of collapse. Panic began to set in. Then he thought of the one structure in the valley that seemed utterly indifferent to the storm, Nemeth's Folly. Bundled in every layer he owned, Osgood ventured out into the crystalline nightmare. The ground was a treacherous mirror. Every step was a risk. He made his way slowly, painstakingly, toward the strange cabin on the hill. As he got closer, the contrast became staggering. His own home and office were entombed in ice, with foot-long daggers of it hanging from every eave. The Nemeth cabin, by contrast, stood clear. The ground around it was littered with sheets of shattered ice the hull had shed, but the structure itself was clean. He approached the door, his head bowed against the stinging, ice-laden wind. To knock, he stepped under the wide overhang of the barge hull, and the world changed. In that 2-foot space between the edge of the hull and the cabin wall, the wind ceased. The relentless pelting of freezing rain vanished. There was a pocket of profound, almost shocking stillness. This was the moment the mockery died. He stood there for a long second, processing the sensory contradiction. He had expected the biting cold and wind to follow him right to the door. He felt instead a pocket of calm. He looked up at the underside of the hull above him. It was bone dry. He looked at the cabin's actual eaves, tucked safely beneath the hull's protection. They were clean, free of the monstrous icicles that adorned every other building. He then looked out from his sanctuary of stillness at the storm raging just feet away, and at his own ice-choked roofline in the distance. The evidence was irrefutable, a physical truth his body understood before his mind could fully accept it. He knocked. The door swung open, and a wave of warm, stable air washed over his face. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overtaxed stove, but a gentle, pervasive warmth. Ferenc Nemeth stood there, his expression calm, unsurprised. "My roof." "The beam," Osgood stammered, the words catching in his throat. "I need to borrow a jack and timbers." Ferenc simply nodded and led him to the small, well-organized workshop behind the cabin. As Osgood gathered the heavy tools, his mind reeled, trying to reconcile what he had just experienced with everything he thought he knew about building. He looked from the simple, warm cabin to the absurd, brilliant boat sitting atop it. "You didn't build a roof, Nemeth," Osgood said, his voice full of a new quiet awe. "You built a shoreline." When the great thaw finally came in February, the true extent of the damage across the valley was revealed. Dozens of outbuildings had collapsed. Many homes had suffered severe structural damage from the weight of the ice and subsequent water intrusion. The cost in repairs would be immense. The cost in firewood had already been ruinous for many. Dale Osgood, once the loudest critic, became Ferenc Nemeth's most fervent advocate. He used his position as township clerk to tell the story to everyone who came through his office. He didn't talk about theory. He spoke of what he had felt standing under that overhang, the stillness and the warmth. He described the clean eaves and the bare hull. He had been converted not by argument, but by evidence. That spring, a steamboat captain named Elias Vance, whose route took him up and down the Des Moines River, heard the tale at the landing. A practical man whose life depended on the integrity of his own vessel's hull, he was intrigued. He rode out to the Nemeth property. He saw the structure, walked around it, and understood the principle almost instantly. He, too, knew how a curved surface dealt with pressure. He took out his logbook and a pencil, and with Ferenc quietly explaining the key details, the 12-inch gap, the sealed perimeter, Vance made a detailed sketch of the design. Over the next year, that sketch traveled the river. Captain Vance was a known and respected figure. When he showed the drawing to settlers and builders at the river landings of Burlington, Keokuk, Davenport, Muscatine, and Dubuque, they listened. The story of the Hungarians' hull roof that shed the great ice storm and saved a fortune in firewood became a piece of practical folklore. By the following autumn, variations of the design began to appear. Some used purpose-built curved frames covered in tin instead of a whole barge hull, but the core principle was the same: a curved outer skin to shed weather, and a sealed air gap to hold the warmth. Ferenc Nemeth's idea was spreading, carried on the very river that had shaped his thinking. Ferenc Nemeth never filed a patent. He never called himself an inventor. He was a craftsman who, faced with a problem, reached for the tools and principles he knew. In doing so, he had created a crude but remarkably effective version of what modern building science would call a vented cold roof or a double-skin facade. He had intuitively grasped the concepts of thermal breaks, vapor barriers, and the profound insulating power of a captive air buffer nearly a century before those terms became commonplace in construction. His solution demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics, born not from textbooks, but from the hands-on high-stakes craft of keeping a river on the outside of a boat. The men who settled the American frontier knew the sky. They saw it as an adversary, a vast and unpredictable source of wind, crushing snow and killing cold. Their architecture reflected this worldview. They built heavy, low, thick-walled fortresses, hunkering down to fight a defensive war against the elements. Their instinct was to resist, to stand firm against the onslaught. Ferenc Nemeth came from a world where the primary adversary was not above, but below. He understood the patient, insidious pressure of water. A barge hull is not a fortress wall. It is a masterpiece of negotiation. Its shape is not about brute resistance, but about deflection. Its curves are designed to shed pressure, to move with the forces applied to it, to make it difficult for the river to get a purchase. Its sealed skin is about absolute integrity, acknowledging that the smallest flaw can lead to total failure. When Ferenc looked at the Iowa sky, he did not see an enemy to be fought. He saw a river flowing overhead, a current of cold air, and a downstream drift of snow. And so he did the only thing that made sense to him. He built a hull to face it. He turned his deep knowledge of one element toward the mastery of another, proving a simple, elegant truth. A hull built to face water already knows the sky. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. Why, if you found this story of ingenuity and practical wisdom valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of forgotten history. And let us know in the comments, have you ever seen an old building with a clever feature that modern designs have forgotten? The content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes. The events, characters, and names depicted are fictionalized for narrative effect, though the techniques and principles are based on real historical practices. Any application of these or similar techniques today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety standards, and professional engineering advice. This video does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.